simple idea for today. You cannot prove history. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea is many people say, well, you have this evidence, that evidence, you could tell what happened in the past when you piece it all together. But I think the basic logic of it is that if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Well, it obviously does. Even if nobody's there to hear, it still made a sound. Whether or not you think philosophically it matters whether it made a sound or not is a whole separate issue from whether or not the tree fell in the forest and nobody heard it. If the tree fell in the forest, regardless of whether or not everybody was there to hear, whether there's any evidence of it, it fell. That's that. That's the thing. You can't prove history. So let me give you an example. When there's a crime scene or some accident, there's lots of eyewitnesses sometimes, and they all give different stories to the police. And it's very interesting because they're all trying to tell the truth. They're all trying to be helpful. But if you actually look at actual footage, they may be way off. Why? Because our memories are very bad. Our recollection may be horrible. They say history is written by the winners, right? The other people don't get to tell their side of stories. The winners just make it up so they look great. But if you think about the medical field, we actually deal with this issue a lot. And let me explain my experience from being a doctor. So if you know, a few years ago, Sheryl Sandberg's husband actually died while they were vacationing in Mexico. He was on a treadmill and later was found next to the treadmill, and they took him to the hospital and they soon found him to be dead. He had a bruise in the back of his head, and they said, well, lost a lot of blood, head trauma, stuff like that. They think it's caused by an arrhythmia, but let's go back a step. When somebody faints, the medical term for that is something called syncope, fainting, just the medical term. And there's a few different reasons you could faint. It's mainly to do with the blood supply to the brain. So sometimes you look at the heart, sometimes you look at the blood vessels leading to your heart, and sometimes you look at the actual brain. And one thing in the brain that you may not see on an imaging study like a CT scan is seizures. Seizures, people think classically like they're like this, but they don't have to be. And we actually put electrodes on people's heads to check to see whether they have seizure-like activity when they're in a hospital. The problem is the seizure event happened hours ago. Some doctors will say, hey, your EEG, which is the electrodes, they look fine. You didn't have a seizure. You can't say that. You can't say now you have no seizure. It means in the past you had no seizure. How does that make any sense? It's like if you went to the store, but before you called, you said, hey, I'm looking for, this or that. Looking for some acai. And then they say, oh, sure, come on by. And you go there and there's no acai. Did they have acai back then? Historical? Well, the guy said they did have acai, but you're wondering if they didn't have acai because you don't see anything there. Well, maybe somebody took it before the time you called and you came. That's very possible. You don't know. You weren't there. Evidence? Who cares? Doesn't mean anything. And that's the same principle with having seizures. You may have had a seizure. We don't see seizures now. We don't see seizure-like activity, but it doesn't mean you did not have a seizure hours ago, because that's the past. That's not now. Many people don't have seizure activities, but they can still have seizure. It looks normal until it's not normal, and lo and behold, they're having a seizure. And that's a simple explanation. We cannot prove the past. It's not logical. It's not evidence-based. It just is. If it happened whether or not we know it or not, whether or not we could prove it or not, whether or not you see any effects or not, it happened. That's a simple idea for today.